Our second lesson comes from 1 Samuel chapter 8 and a couple of verses from chapter 11. Then all of the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us, like other nations." But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you should solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all of the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the way of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkey and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we may also be like the other nations, and that our king may govern us, and go out before us, and fight our battles." Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they sacrificed offerings of well-being before the Lord, and there Saul and all the Israelites rejoiced greatly. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, there was a big wedding that happened recently. I don't think any of us were in attendance. I think that perhaps my invitation to the marriage of His Royal Highness Prince Harry of Wales to Miss Meghan Markle was lost in the mail. And that's probably a good thing, because I'm afraid I would have had to send my regrets. You know, I've got so much going on in my life right now. It's just not a convenient time to hop across the pond to attend a wedding. But I do have to admit that I was one of the millions that set my DVD to record the ceremony that was in the early morning hours of May 19th. And I'm glad I did, because the wedding sermon given by Bishop Michael Curry, who is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, was tremendous. This is the best sermon I have heard in years. You need to go find this sermon on the internet. Now, there's transcripts of it. You can read it, but I know it's on YouTube. Go and find it and spend 20 minutes watching this sermon. Wow. If I could preach like that, well, I guess I would be the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States. But anyway, I digress. Go find the sermon, watch it. Now, from the time that the engagement was announced up to the wedding, and even in the days and weeks after the wedding, anytime there was anything on the TV that talked about anything having to do with British royalty, my husband would shake his head and proclaim, "I don't understand. We fought a war with these people so we wouldn't have to care about them. Why do we care about this?" The fact that I can quote him verbatim tells you how much he said it. Now, I hate to have to admit this, especially with him in the room, but he has a point. Over 240 years ago, the colonists were tired of being ruled by a king, and they gained their independence after a long and hard-fought war. But despite our battle for independence, today our culture seems fascinated with the British royalty. And to quote my husband, why? Now, some people theorize that it has to do with our culture's interest in people who are famous just simply for being famous. If I say the name Kim Kardashian, can anybody tell me what this woman does for a living? No, she is just famous for being famous. So our culture is fascinated with those kind of stories. So theorists say that part of it has to do with that, and part of it has to do with the Cinderella story that was Lady Diana Spencer, and the story that now continues through her sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. Well, we have, for whatever reason, some kind of fascination, some kind of attraction to the British monarchy. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily want a monarchy in the United States. Because when it comes down to it, we really know very little about this form of government. Many people say we have a democracy. That's not true. We have a democratic constitutional republic. That means that we democratically, in theory, elect the people to represent us, that we want representing us, and they go off and, in theory, represent us the way that we want to be represented. I will let you be the judge whether that works or not. It's not my intent to start a political debate here, but that is the basis of our government, a democratic constitutional republic. And because that's the kind of government that we use in this country, it might make us hard-pressed to put ourselves in the sandals of the Israelites in today's text from Samuel. The Israelites want a king. All of the nations around them have a king. They want a king too. And they are pressuring Samuel, this little boy that we heard about last week, who heard the voice of God and didn't know it was the voice of God until he was told. The same little boy is now grown up and is a leader of the nation of Israel. And the Israelites are telling him, we want a king. Anoint us a king. Now, it had been about 220 years between the time that Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to this point in history where the Israelites are saying, we want a king. And for that entire 220-year period, the Israelites understood themselves as a loose confederacy of tribes with no king other than God himself. Now, God would lift up human leaders as they were needed. He lifted up Moses. He lifted up Joshua. This continued through this 220-year time period until the time of Samuel. Samuel was a judge. Judges were the physical presence of God, the king, among the Israelite people. When there was a problem, when there was a disagreement, when there was something that needed to be settled, people would go to the judge. People like Samson, Deborah, Samuel. And God would always call up a new judge when that needed to happen. Well, as Samuel got older, he decided that his 2 sons should be the next judges of Israel. That was out of character for Samuel. Usually he waited for God's instructions. He waited for God's guidance to tell him what to do. This time it showed a very unusual disobedience to God. He went on his own and made his sons the next judges without God telling him to do it. And so the result was the institution of a hereditary line of succession. Samuel, then his sons, then their sons. And the Israelites didn't like it. It's because Samuel's sons were nothing like Samuel. They didn't follow his ways. They did whatever they had to do. They said whatever they had to say to get what they wanted, without really caring about the good of the people, without really listening. As long as there was something in it for them and they got glory, they were on board with it. Well, the tribal elders came up with a plan, and they went to Samuel and said, "We want a king." Samuel was ticked. He did not like this. But he goes to God in prayer and says, "The people want a king. What should I do?" And God told him that the people's demand for a king wasn't necessarily a rejection of Samuel as much as it was a rejection of God himself. But God told him, if they want a king, give them a king, but make sure that they understand the consequences. And so Samuel goes into a long explanation of what would happen if a king were appointed. He's going to take your sons. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take 1/10 of whatever you own. You will be slaves to whatever the king wants. But the Israelites didn't care. We want a king. And ultimately, under God's direction, Samuel anointed Saul to be that king. Apparently, the Israelites had come to a place where they decided that when it came to governance, God was not enough. Sometimes life can take us in a direction where we reach that place as well. We may try to view God as our ultimate leader and try to apply our faith across the board of our lives. But we can also find ourselves in times when it seems like God isn't enough for the pain, the loss, the grief, the problems, the trials, the challenges that we are experiencing. There's a story about a little girl who was in bed all tucked in for the night, and a thunderstorm started and she got scared. And so she called for her mom, and her mom goes into her room to comfort her and to provide her solace. And she tells the little girl that there's nothing to worry about because God would take care of her. Well, the little girl looked at her mom and answered, "But I want somebody with skin." What she was really saying was that God isn't enough to deal with this fear that I'm feeling. Have you ever thought something like that? God isn't enough to handle what I'm feeling. I have these troubles. I have these problems. I'm going through this situation, and people keep telling me that God is all I need. Well, I've prayed, and my problems are still here. I need someone with skin to help me. God is all you need. It's a statement that we Christians use a lot. when we're trying to take care of somebody, when we're encouraging them, when we're trying to uplift them. And it's not that the statement isn't true, because God is indeed all that we need. But according to author J. Grace Pennington, the issue is that the statement is vague. The word need is ambiguous. We can say that we need God. We need food. We need a break. We need a shelter. All of those are needs, but are they the same kind of need? We can be talking about very different things when we talk about our needs. Pennington goes on to say that our hearts seem to be need factories. We need this, we need that, we need this. And we're told that Jesus is the answer for all of our needs. And yet, knowing that God is all we need doesn't do anything for the longings that we sometimes have. The longing for a happy marriage, the longing for health or rest, the longing for fellowship and relationships with others. God doesn't always seem to supply that need. And when that longing continues, the emptiness can weigh us down. And then we get angry because we need this and God isn't providing it. And then we can feel guilty because we're angry at God, because God is all that we need. And then that guilt can lead to thoughts of panic or doubt. Gosh, is God really all I need? Is God enough? Pennington identifies the actual problem here. God isn't liquid. We can't have a heart and a soul filled with all of these things, pour God in, and then expect God to go into those areas of holes, go into those areas of voids. God doesn't work like that. God is a solid. He is his own shape. He doesn't come in and transmorph himself into fitting what we need. In Ezekiel, God tells us that he will remove the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. Our hearts aren't meant to be hard, hollow receptacles that we fill with stuff and then pour God in to fill all of the empty spots. It's not about God being enough to fill our needs, the needs that we determine that we need. It's about God being more than enough, filling us in ways that we don't expect or don't even know that we need. But that still leaves the question, when I'm in pain, when I'm facing trials or challenges, how do I get to that point? Maybe the answer lies somewhere in between God's enoughness and the skin that the little girl was asking for. Christianity Today is a magazine publication, and last year, after the shooting at a Baptist church in Texas, they published an article that highlighted research showing that people of faith, particularly those who receive support from their churches and their religious communities, fare better in recovery from a crisis like this, like they experienced. The research showed that they experienced fewer symptoms of depression, and their PTSD was not as great, and their faith didn't suffer as much. Similar to what happens in natural disasters, religious support buffers the relationship between the loss and the negative outcomes. So even when the suffering is tremendous, Survivors with high levels of support from their faith communities don't show the level of worsening symptoms experienced by people who don't have it. That's a way of saying that we, as God's people, are God's skin. We are the tangible ways that people learn that God really is enough. We are the ones who put on the skin of God and show that God's is sufficient. So when we're in pain, letting the Christian community minister to us is where we learn from experience that God is enough. It is the people of God that show others that God truly is really enough. Now, sometimes we fall into the trap of believing that God's sufficiency, God's enoughness, God's provision of our needs means a total solution to all of our problems. I have a dear friend who calls this Santa Claus God. If we're good and we do what we're supposed to do, God gives us what we want. He doesn't let anything bad happen to us. Now, I'm not sure where that idea even comes from. All we have to do is look at the disciples and their lives after Christ returned to heaven to know and to learn that following Christ does not mean the end to suffering of problems and trials. Sometimes it can even bring more onto us. But perhaps those sufferings and trials are a way for us to realize that while we might not get everything we want or that we think we need, God gives us everything that we need and more. There is an author whose name is Anne Lamott. You might have heard of her. She writes fiction and nonfiction. She writes Christian and secular. Her topics cover a wide gamut. She was a single mother who found her way to God after several years of drug and alcohol abuse. And a big part of what enabled her to embrace the Christian way and to continue to live a Christian life was the support and love she found from members of a small church that she started attending. People who acted and put on the skin of God's enoughness for her. Now, after becoming a Christian, her life still wasn't easy, but she experienced the help of the Lord through friendship and prayers of those faithful people of that church. Here's something she wrote about that time. It's funny. I always imagined when I was a kid that adults had some kind of inner toolbox full of shiny tools. There was the saw of discernment, the hammer of wisdom, the sandpaper of patience. But when I grew up, I found that life hands you these rusty, bent old tools. Things like friendships, prayer, conscience, honesty, and said, do the best you can with these. They're gonna have to do. And mostly, against all odds, those rusty old tools are enough. When we, as God's people, put on God's skin and use these rusty old tools, through God, they are indeed enough. Amen.